"No one's getting through that," someone muttered. The words hung in the air, carried on the sleet that sliced sideways across the open tarmac of Fort Nash. Wind lashed the field like a whip, flattening the flags and drowning the engines in frozen howls. Medevac crews stood clustered under a hastily erected canopy, gear half-loaded, eyes trained on the grayed-out skies. All aircraft grounded. No rotor could hold steady in this kind of storm. In the distance, barely visible through the horizontal snow, the runway lights flickered, pale ghosts beneath a storm that showed no signs of relenting. The Kodiak Science Outpost was out there, buried under white. 2 researchers were already in critical condition. The rest were running out of fuel, heat, and time. "Jesus," a medic muttered, rubbing his gloved hands together. "This storm's a coffin." Then a voice cut through the static. "Calm, low, steady. I can fly it." The group turned. Lieutenant Rachel Moore stood just outside the shelter's edge, sleet dotting her face, hands still at her sides. Her coat flapped against the wind, pilot badge glinting faintly on her chest, a silver set of wings that hadn't seen a cockpit in years. One of the younger engineers blinked. "You're not cleared." Rachel didn't answer. She stepped forward instead, slowly, until she was fully in the light. Her gloved fingers tapped twice on the badge. "He taught me how," she said. The older officers glanced at one another, uncertain. The badge belonged to her father, Captain David Moore, the name etched into every flight logbook that mattered at Fort Nash. He had died 15 years ago in a Blackhawk over Denali, flying through a hurricane to reach a crashed civilian aircraft. They found pieces of the tail but never the cockpit. Rachel's gaze didn't shift. She wasn't asking. They had kept her in the hangars. 6 years of tools and turbine grease, duct tape on gloves and frostbite on knuckles. Rachel had spent her days crawling into engine bellies, calibrating altimeters, tracing leaks through frozen rotors and hydraulic vanes. Everyone knew her name in maintenance. She could fix a tail rotor in under 4 hours. She could swap a transmission solo if given time. The crews respected her, but her hands remembered more than tools. In the simulator bays, late at night after her shift, Rachel flew. Not for records, not for praise, only for muscle memory. The hours she logged there had been immaculate. Storm landings, blackout drills, emergency descent through vertical cloud walls. She flew routes her father had once flown, Kodiak, Juneau, St. Paul, mapping his movements through archived logs. The flight deck always felt like home, even if no one called her pilot. They said she was too valuable in maintenance. That was the phrase, too valuable to risk. So she stayed in the background, watched others rise, saw second lieutenants, some still trembling on startup checklists, assigned to fly missions she'd rehearsed in silence 100 times. It never seemed to bother her outward. She nodded, saluted, returned to her tools. But each time they passed her over, something small eroded. Then came the collapse. It was just past midnight when the distress call came from Kodiak. The weather had closed in too fast. Ice had blocked their exhaust vents. Power systems on backup. 2 researchers, one diabetic, one in dialysis, were at risk of organ shutdown within hours. There was no road in, no time for snowcats. The crew assembled. She was in the hangar already, fixing a secondary blade on Hawk 9. She heard the sirens, followed the sound. Inside the briefing room, voices grew louder, frantic. Then, the pilot assigned to fly medevac, Lieutenant Breyer, collapsed to the floor. Stroke. They said later it was minor, caught early, but he was down, and the clock was ticking. Rachel stepped forward. Her voice was quiet. "I can fly it." The room went silent, briefly, before someone scoffed. A major in cold weather ops raised a brow. "You ever even seen real fog?" Another chuckled, not unkindly. "You're not a pilot just because your dad was." Rachel said nothing. Her jaw clenched once. Then she turned, walked out. Snow was already filling her footprints before she'd crossed the tarmac back to the hangar. That night, alone, she stood beside the Blackhawk she had kept alive through 2 winters and a gearbox failure. She ran her hand along the fuselage. Beneath the paint, beneath the rivets, she could still feel the bones of her father's teachings. Every evening as a child, he'd sit with his maps open on the kitchen table, tracing terrain with his finger. "Read the wind like a river," he'd say. "Know where it pools, where it tears." She was 12 the night he told her about Kodiak. "The ridges play tricks," he'd whisper. "That fog isn't fog, it's tea." Now, 15 years later, The air smelled the same: cold metal, distant fuel, and silence. She stood there until the last work light flickered out. Then, slowly, she reached into her flight bag and unwrapped the badge she kept beneath her thermal layers. Captain David Moore, U.S. Army Aviation, Kia 2010. The silver was dulled, but it caught the hangar light just enough. She pinned it to her chest and waited. The emergency briefing reconvened at 0400 hours. Outside, the blizzard was merciless. Horizontal sheets of snow carving invisible lines across the open field. The landing pad no longer existed, not visibly. Weather satellites showed wind shear peaking at 60 knots along the coastal ranges. Kodiak's last signal had arrived half an hour ago. Backup generator nearing depletion. Satellite link flickering. A child's voice, barely audible, had ended the transmission. "It's cold, Mama said. It's colder than Mars." Inside the command room, tension had hardened into paralysis. Colonel Avery stood alone at the front of the room, facing a wall of shifting satellite feeds and red-coded readouts. The pilots around him, veterans of night ops, fogland insertions, Arctic evac, were silent. Each man knew what it meant to fly blind into that quadrant. No one volunteered. No one even moved. Then a file appeared on the screen. Simflight Archive, Lieutenant Rachel Moore, Kodiak Region, 9 variants. The cursor clicked through logs. Night flights. Ice penetration. Emergency turns into high wind. Each entry marked pass. Some flagged extreme realism override. For a moment, no one breathed. Colonel Avery turned. His voice carried the calm of someone who had already made peace with his decision. Lieutenant Moore trained for this mission without ever being asked to. Murmurs broke the silence. Confused glances. Recognition dawning. Major Keller narrowed his eyes. "That's simulation, Colonel. This storm's not a sim." Captain Ng, seated closest to the data screen, studied the flight maps again. He'd logged 3,200 hours across 3 continents. He'd lost a co-pilot once, in Peru. He understood failure, and he understood precision. "She flew the route 9 times, he said finally, in worse visibility, with recovery options planned down to the minute. If she's got the nerve to step up, we clear her." Colonel Avery nodded. Recommendation noted. No one objected. Rachel was already standing at the back. She stepped forward without a word. The room parted. Captain Ng rose to his feet, walked over, and handed her the keys to Hawk 9. The same Black Hawk she had kept alive all these years, now as weathered as the badge over her heart. He didn't speak until she turned to leave. "If anyone can fly through that storm," he said, "it's you." The doors opened to the sound of wind screaming across the tarmac. She walked alone, the keys in her hand, badge catching the floodlights. Her boots sank into the ice crust as she moved. No crowd followed. No one cheered. They just watched, some ashamed, some awed, as she crossed the field toward the waiting machine. The snow swallowed her trail behind her. In seconds, it was as if she had never stood in that room at all. At the chopper's side, she paused. One gloved hand on the side panel, one on the badge over her chest. Her breath rose in silver clouds. Her voice was barely audible. "Let's go, Dad." "One more time." She climbed in. The cold hit harder in the cockpit. Every surface was metal or ice or memory. Rachel slid into the seat with practiced precision, checking harness straps, flipping switches, each motion crisp, each muscle tuned by years of watching others do this, and by nights spent alone in simulators pretending she was allowed. Power surged. The rotors began their slow churn. The Black Hawk groaned like something half asleep and angry. Hawk 9 wasn't new. Its systems complained with every voltage shift, but it was alive, and so was she. The weather system howled across the comms. Visibility, nil. Wind shear, volatile. Radio crackle filled the silence between diagnostics. One last check. She took a breath and lifted off. Above the base, the world dissolved. She entered the storm like falling through a curtain. Nothing existed beyond the glass. Even the blinking horizon lights disappeared. The cockpit trembled. Altimeter fluttered. Rachel leaned forward, nose nearly touching the panel. Her fingers traced the throttle with delicate control. Ice crystals smashed against the windshield like birdshot. Altitude held. 700, then 680. She corrected. Then the alarms began. Pitch unstable. Hydraulic secondary failure. Visual horizon lost. The cockpit screamed warnings she had read about in manuals but never heard in reality. She gritted her teeth, adjusted trim, adjusted again. Hawk 9 tilted, left skid catching an updraft. She compensated. Her pulse quickened but her hands didn't shake. Then, through the static and cold, a voice. Not over the comms. Not from the base. A voice like breath beside her ear. Level the pitch. Let her breathe. She froze. Dad? She whispered. Silence. Then, again, soft, precise, unmistakable. You've got this, Mija. She didn't question it. Her hands moved faster now. Smoother, as if they were following choreography someone else had written. Her father's voice filled the cockpit. Not loud, not ghostly, just present. She remembered his hand guiding hers over the controls at age 8, his voice calm as she weaved through model clouds in a cardboard simulator. The machine listens to calm, he used to say. You panic, it panics. Let her breathe, she repeated now, quietly. Eyes locked on the dark. The storm fought back. Winds howled sideways across the rotors. Sensors flickered. She flew by feel. Trim tabs twitching beneath her fingers. She corrected for micro-shear near the pass. Her right boot tapped the rudder ever so slightly. Her father's rhythm, not hers. They used to fly these drills in their minds while cooking dinner. When the horizon fails, he'd say, you fly by heart. Another gust. Harder this time. She dropped 30 feet in a snap. The child's voice from the transmission echoed in her memory. Mama said the angels wouldn't forget us. She climbed again. Kodiak's radio beacon began to break through the static. Faint but real. She wasn't flying anymore. She was remembering. The coastline appeared like a ghost's shadow, barely outlined through the windshield's frost. Below, a helipad, buried in snow. She brought Hawk 9 down with almost no visibility, trusting the terrain maps imprinted on her brain. Touchdown was rough. The skids caught and dragged briefly, then settled. Engines whined down. Silence. Outside the window, a small figure ran across the clearing. A girl, no older than 7, bundled in a parka far too big for her. She reached the chopper, slipped once in the snow, stood again. Rachel opened the side hatch. The child's voice was soft, as if afraid to break the moment. Mama said the angels wouldn't forget us. Rachel knelt, held her arms out. We didn't, she said. The storm didn't end. It didn't pause to let them load. It didn't clear so she could fly back easier. It roared, relentless, while she helped the research team secure their gear and stabilize the patients. Inside the outpost, emergency lighting cast long, flickering shadows against cinderblock walls. The dialysis patient, a woman in her 40s, was unconscious, barely holding on. The boy with her, her son, refused to leave her side, clutching her hand like it could still keep her alive. Rachel moved through the room with quiet urgency. She coordinated loading, secured the medkit, reinforced the Blackhawk's internal clamps for the makeshift gurney. Not once did she stop moving. Not once did she ask for thanks. The scientists were wide-eyed. The youngest technician, barely out of college, kept watching her like she wasn't real. How did you even land? Someone whispered. Rachel didn't answer. She just nodded toward the open hatch. We lift in 4. The return flight was worse. Ice slicked every exposed surface. The rotors pulsed against wind pressure, and for a moment midair, Rachel thought she might lose tail control entirely. But then came the voice again, clearer this time. You know what you're doing. Just breathe. She didn't need to look. She knew he wasn't there, not really. But every part of her felt him. 1,000 miles of memory. 1,000 nights studying the same routes he flew. She adjusted trim again, cross-checked altitude, climbed through the wall of sleep. And the Blackhawk listened. It took nearly 2 hours to return. Twice what it should have taken. But they made it. The moment the landing gear touched down at Fort Nash, the tarmac erupted. Not in cheers. There were no crowds, no waiting cameras, but in motion. Medics ran forward. Colonel Avery stepped out into the snow without a coat. Captain Ng followed, carrying a thermal blanket. The base chaplain crossed himself when he saw Hawk 9 settle without damage. Rachel powered down the engines slowly. Her hands were steady. When she stepped out, someone tried to help her down. She refused the hand, walked on her own. Behind her, the small girl clambered out next, clutching the edge of Rachel's coat. She didn't let go until the medics gently guided her toward warmth. Colonel Avery met Rachel with eyes full of something unreadable. Flight record says 28 minutes late, he said quiet. Rachel blinked. I didn't look at the clock. He nodded once. You will be debris. They'll want to know how you navigated that corridor without radar. She looked toward Hawk 9. Then toward the horizon where the storm still hung. Memory, she said. 3 days later, the press found the story. A field report had leaked. One of the younger pilots, too stunned to keep quiet, had told a cousin. The cousin blogged about it. Within hours, photos of Hawk 9 surfaced. Grainy, snow-covered. The word miracle was used too often, but Rachel didn't speak publicly until the press briefing. A conference room, a podium, rows of microphones too high, cameras that made her flinch. She wore her flight suit, the badge still pinned over her heart. A reporter asked, "Lieutenant Moore, weren't you afraid? You had no clearance, no co-pilot, no visual markers. What made you go?" Rachel looked at them quietly, then said, not loudly, but clearly, I was afraid, but I was more afraid of letting no one try." Silence followed, not awkward, respectful. A second reporter asked, "Your simulations were off the record. Why did you train for something you were never assigned to do?" Rachel didn't smile. She just said, "Because someone had to be ready, even if no one asked." The briefing ended soon after. She returned to the hangars, to maintenance logs, to the crew she still considered her people. But things changed. Her flight status was updated, active, her badge made permanent, and outside her locker door, taped carefully, was a piece of folded paper, a drawing, a helicopter with wings. Beneath it, "One day, I'll fly too. Will you teach me?" Rachel stared at it a long time, then reached for her pen. Everything blurred. The snow wasn't falling. It was horizontal, blinding. The world outside the windshield was nothing but swirling white and the occasional flash of something darker, like the ghost of a mountain. Rachel kept her hands on the stick, fingers locked but not stiff. Hawk 9 trembled in the crosswinds. Pitch warning, altitude drift, terrain proximity. Every alarm she'd ever studied was now screaming at her at once. It was less a cockpit than a war zone of blinking reds and synthetic voices warning her to land, abort, eject. She didn't. The altimeter jittered. Airspeed dropped. The rotor strain meter tipped briefly into yellow. Rachel adjusted the pitch trim manually, then cross-checked her path again, though her visibility had dropped to almost zero. She was flying blind, guided only by instinct and the geography she had memorized from years of tracing her father's logs. In the old days, David Moore would fly with one boot braced against the console and a toothpick in his mouth. "Read the wind," he used to say. "It'll tell you what the mountain won't." Now Rachel felt the pressure shift across the fuselage like a living thing. A gust slammed into them sideways. The Black Hawk tilted, shuddered. She corrected. Barely. Another alarm, icing detected. The windshield fogged to white. She couldn't see the horizon. Then, so quiet she almost didn't hear it, came the voice again. "Let her breathe, Mija." She exhaled through her nose, slow and even. "Reset the throttle. You're flying too tight," the voice said, warm, calm. "You're fighting her. Let her glide." Rachel blinked tears away, not from emotion, but from strain. Sweat beaded under her collar despite the cold. Her fingers ached from pressure. "I've got it," she whispered. "I've got it." "Then fly," her father said. She adjusted the flaps and trimmed the pitch. Gradually, the vibrations eased. Not gone, but balanced. He was right. The machine wasn't her enemy. The wind wasn't either. They were just elements, forces to read, not to dominate. It was how he had flown. And now, it was how she would too. As she neared the Kodiak Pass, the terrain below began to shift. Jagged bluffs hidden beneath snow banks, ice drifts along the coastal ridges. No GPS, no visual beacons. But Rachel knew this route from childhood table maps, from black and white weather prints her father used to pin up during storm season. He always called Kodiak the corner pocket, a place only memory could navigate. She followed that memory now. Every minute that passed tightened the margin for the patients. The backup generator at the research outpost was estimated to fail within the hour. After that, there would be no life support for the dialysis patient. No power, no heat. Rachel dipped low, trusting her instincts. The rotors chopped mist. Trees appeared below like black knives. She spotted a ridgeline briefly visible through the whiteout. That was her window. She banked hard, leaning into the turn. The helicopter screamed but obeyed. "I see it," she whispered. But the landing zone was buried. No pad, no flare, just white on white. She had 30 seconds. "I'm not you," she said aloud. "I'm not you, but I remember everything." Silence. Then, "You don't have to be me," the voice returned. "You're better." The landing was more guess than precision. She flared the tail rotor against a gust, counterbalanced the drift, and set down hard. The left skid punched through an ice crust. The chopper rocked, but it held. The moment the rotors slowed, her hands dropped from the controls. shaking slightly now that they were allowed to. Snow battered the fuselage. She heard a shout. Then a figure ran toward her. 2, 3. And behind them, from the research shelter, a child broke free. She wore mismatched gloves, a parka 2 sizes too big, snow up to her knees. She stumbled, then kept running. Rachel hit the emergency release, unlatched the side door. The girl reached the skid, eyes wide. Mama said the angels wouldn't forget us. Rachel dropped to her knees on the icy floor of the chopper, met the girl eye to eye. We didn't, she said. She never found out who the girl was. Kodiak's evacuation had been swift. Once her mother stabilized, the family was flown to Anchorage, then onward to Seattle for long-term care. The child had left the drawing in Rachel's pocket, folded so small she almost missed it during debris. It stayed on her locker ever since. She never laminated it, never framed it. The paper was soft now, its edges curled, but she looked at it each morning, before each shift, before each flight. A reminder, not of the storm, not of survival, but of what it meant to be remembered for showing up. A few months later, a new class of cadets arrived at Fort Nash. Among them, women, half the cohort. Wide-eyed, boots too clean, nerves visible in every breath. Rachel stood before them, silent at first. Then she pointed to the drawing, told them the story, not for glory, not for validation, but because one of them, someday, would be asked to fly into silence. And maybe, they'd need to know someone else had gone before. She became a mentor. Quietly, consistently, never asked for applause, never sought promotion. But when new pilots took their first real flight, many touched the badge over their chest, mimicking her gesture. And in a corner of the base flight museum, beneath a decommissioned tail rotor from Hawk 9, hung a plaque. She flew when no one asked her to. And because she did, others could. Rachel still walked the flight line most mornings, alone, always early. The sleet didn't bother her much anymore, because somewhere beyond the storm, someone always waited. And because somewhere in the snow, a girl was learning to fly.